Thanks for joining me here. I am Shiromi Asario. I'm a professional audiobook narrator, and today I'm going to be narrating a chapters 11 and 12 of Lud-in-the-Mist by Hope Mirrlees. Um, so it's not a well-known book, but I guarantee you, if you are a fantasy reader, your favorite fantasy authors will actually reference this book as being a big influence, um, especially if those authors happen to be from the UK. And this is a book that came out, I believe, in 1920 something. I should know this. I do not. Anyway, this is a public domain title that I will be releasing. It'll probably be coming out around February ish. Yeah, February ish. It kind of depends on the distributor. But as I said, I'm a professional audiobook narrator. You can look me up on Audible. I have done over 300 titles. And yeah, just sit back and enjoy Blood in the Mist. But bear with me 1 minute. Minute. I can speak properly, I promise. While I get all of my stuff set up. Here we go. Chapter 11. A Stronger Antidote Than Reason. Master Nathaniel sat at his old nurse's feet for some minutes after she had stopped singing. Both his limbs and his mind seemed to be bathed in a cool, refreshing pool. So Endymion Lear and Hempy had reached by very different paths the same conclusion, that, after all, there was nothing to be frightened about, that neither in sky, sea, nor earth was there to be found a cavern dark and sinister enough to serve as a lair for it, his secret fear. Yes, but there were facts as well as shadows. Against facts, Hempy had given him no charm. Supposing that what had happened to Prunella should happen to Ranulph, that he should vanish forever across the debatable hills. But it had not happened yet, nor should it happen as long as Ranulph's father had wits and muscles. He might be a poor, useless figure. He might be a poor, useless creature when menaced by the figments of his own fancy, but by the golden apples of the West, he would no longer sit there shaking its shadows while perhaps realities were mustering their battalions against Ranulph. It was for him to see that Dorimare became a country that his son could live in security. It was as if he had suddenly seen something white and straight, a road or a river cutting through a somber moonlit landscape, and the straight white thing was his own will to action. He sprang to his feet and took 2 or 3 paces up and down the room. "But I tell you, Hempy," he cried as if continuing a conversation, "they're all against me. How can I work by myself? They're all against me, I say." "Get along with you, Master Nat," jeered Hempy tenderly. "You were always one to think folks were against you. When you were a little boy, it was always, 'You're not cross with me, Hempy, are you?' And peering up at me with your little anxious eyes. There was we. There was we. There was me. And there was me with no more idea of being cross with you than of jumping over the moon. But I tell you, they are all against me," he cried impatiently. "They blame me for what has happened, and Ambrose was so insulting that I had to tell him never to put his foot into my house again. Well, it isn't the first time you and Master Ambrose have quarrelled, and it won't be the first time you make it up again. It was, 'Hempy, Brosy won't play fair,' or 'Hempy, it's my turn for a ride on the donkey, and Nat won't let me.' And then in a few minutes it was all over and forgotten. So you must just step across to Master Ambrose's and walk in as if nothing had happened. and you'll see he'll be as pleased as Punch to see you." As he listened, he realized that it would be very pleasant to put his pride in his pocket and rush off to Ambrose and say that he was willing to admit anything that Ambrose chose, that he was a hopelessly inefficient mayor, that his slothfulness during these past months had been criminal, even if Ambrose insisted that he was an eater of, and smuggler of, and receiver of fairy fruit, all rolled into one. If only Ambrose would make friends again. Pride and resentment are not indigenous to the human heart, and perhaps it is due to the gardener's innate love of the exotic that we take such pains to make them thrive. But Master Nathaniel was a self-indulgent man, and ever ready to sacrifice both dignity and expediency to the pleasure of yielding to a sentimental— I don't know this word. I genuinely do not know this word. Wish or inclination. Velleity. Okay. And ever ready to sacrifice both dignity and expediency to the pleasure of yielding to a sentimental velleity. "By the golden apples of the West, Hempy!" he cried joyfully. "You're right! I'll dash across to Ambrose's before I'm a minute older." And he made eagerly for the door. On the threshold, he suddenly remembered how he had seen the door of his chapel ajar, and he paused to ask Hempy if she'd been up there recently and had forgotten to lock it. But she had not been there since early spring. "That's odd," said Master Nathaniel, and then he dismissed the matter from his mind in the exhilarating prospect of making up with Ambrose. It is curious what tricks a quarrel, or even a short absence, can play with our mental picture of even our most intimate friends. A few minutes later, as Master Ambrose looked at his old playmate standing at the door, grinning a little sheepishly, he felt as if he had just awakened from a nightmare. This was not the most criminally negligent mayor with whom the town of Lud-in-the-Mist had ever been cursed. Still less was it the sinister figure evoked by Endymion Lear. It was just queer old Nat, whom he had known all his life. And just as on a map of the country round Lud, in the zigzagging lines he could almost see the fish and rushes of the streams they represented, could almost count the milestones on the straight lines that stood for roads. So, with regard to the face of his old friend, every pucker and wrinkle was so familiar that he felt he could have told you every one of the jokes and little worries of which they were the impress. Master Nathaniel, still grinning a little sheepishly, stuck out his hand. Master Ambrose frowned, blew his nose, tried to look severe, and then grasped the hand. And they stood there, fully 2 minutes, wringing each other's hand and laughing and blinking to keep away the tears. And then Master Ambrose said, "Come into the pipe room, Nat, and try a glass of my new flower and amber. You old rascal, I believe it was that brought you." A little later, when Master Ambrose was conducting Master Nathaniel back to his house, his arm linked in his, they happened to pass Endymion Lear. For a few seconds he stood staring after them as they glimmered down the lane beneath the faint moonlight, and he did not look overjoyed. That night was filled to the brim for Master Nathaniel with sweet, dreamless sleep. As soon as he laid his head on the pillow, he seemed to dive into some pleasant, unknown element, fresher than air, more caressing than water, an element in which he had not bathed since he first heard the note 30 years ago. And he woke up the next morning, light-hearted and eager. So fine a medicine was the will. Oh. It's not that I misread it, but I just felt like the intonation was a bit off right there, so So fine a medicine was the will to action. He had been confirmed in it by his talk the previous evening with Master Ambrose. He had found his old friend by no means crushed by his grief. In fact, his attitude to the loss of Moonlove rather shocked Master Nathaniel, for he had remarked grimly that to have vanished forever over the hills was, perhaps, considering the vice to which she had succumbed, the best thing that could have happened to her. There had always been something rather brutal about Ambrose's common sense. But he was as anxious as Master Nathaniel himself that drastic measures should immediately be taken for stopping the illicit trade and arresting the smugglers. They had decided what these measures ought to be, and the following days were spent in getting them approved and passed by the Senate. Though the name of Master Nathaniel stank in the nostrils of his colleagues, their respect for the Constitution was too deep-seated to permit their opposing the Mayor of Lud-in-the-Mist and High Seneschal of Dorimare, besides Master Ambrose. Honeysuckle was a man of considerable weight in their councils, and they were not uninfluenced by the fact that he was the seconder of all the mayor's proposals. So a couple of yeomen were placed at each of the gates of Lud, with orders to examine not only the baggage of everyone entering the town, but, as well, to rummage through every wagon of hay, every sack of flour, every frail of... What is a frail of fruit? I've never heard that term before. Okay. Hold on a second. My teleprompter app sometimes has a bit of a mind of its own. It skips ahead. It's doing it again. All right. Every frail of fruit or vegetables. As well, the West Road was patrolled from Lud to the confines of the Elfin Marches, where a consignment of yeomanry was sent to camp out, with orders day and night to watch the hills, and the clerk of the Senate. And the clerk to the Senate was ordered to compile a dossier of every inhabitant of Lud. The energy displayed by Master Nathaniel in getting these measures passed did a good deal towards restoring his reputation among the townsfolk. Nevertheless, that social barometer, Ebenezer Prim, continued to send his new apprentice instead of coming himself to wind his clocks. And the grandfather clock, it would seem, was protesting against the sight, for according to the servants, it would suddenly move its hands rapidly up and down its dial, which made it look like a face, alternating between a smirk and an expression of woe. And one morning, Pimple, the little indigo page... I'm gonna just... That's gonna be a word I'm going to just nix from the script. Like I said, this book was written 100 years ago, and it's not bad, but every now and again, I'm not going to refer to somebody as an indigo page. That's just awful. I mean, would I change a book that was about racism? No, I wouldn't, but this isn't that. It's just, we live in a different time. The little page ran screaming with terror into the kitchen, for he vowed from the orifice at the bottom of the dial there had suddenly come shooting out a green tongue like a lizard's tail. As none of Master Nathaniel's measures brought to light a single smuggler or a single consignment of fairy fruit, the Senate were beginning to congratulate themselves on The Senate were beginning to congratulate themselves on having at last destroyed the evil that for centuries had menaced their country, when Mumchance discovered in one day 3 people clearly under the influence of the mysterious drug, and with their mouth and hands stained with strangely colored juices. One of them was a pygmy peddler from the north, and as he scarcely knew a word of Dorimarite, no information could be extracted from him as to how he had procured the fruit. Another was a little street urchin who had found some shreds in a dustbin, but was in too dazed a state to remember exactly where. The third was the deaf mute known as Bawdy Bess, and of course, no information could be got from a deaf mute. Clearly, then, there was some leakage in the admirable system of the Senate. As a result, rebellious lampoons against the inefficient mayor were found nailed to the doors of the guild hall, and Master Nathaniel received several anonymous letters of a vaguely threatening nature, bidding him to cease to meddle with matters that did not concern him, lest they should prove to concern him but too much. But so well had the antidote of action been agreeing with his constitution that he merely flung them into the fire with a grim laugh, and a vow to redouble his efforts. Okay, that's actually the end of chapter 11. Yeah, and as you can see, it's actually quite a short chapter. A bit unusual for this book, but that's why I'm doing 2 chapters tonight and not 1. And I will be swiftly moving on to chapter 12 just as soon as I start the file. Okay. Chapter 12. Dame Marigold hears the tap of a woodpecker. Miss Primrose Crabapple's trial was still dragging on, clogged by all the foolish complications arising from the legal fiction that had permitted her arrest. If you remember, in the eye of the law, fairy fruit was regarded as woven silk, and many days were wasted in a learned discussion of the various characteristics of gold tissues. Stick tuffetity. Okay. Ah, this word. I wish I could just turn the camera around so you could see this word. Tuffafitties. Stick tuffafitties. Yeah, there we go. Stick tuffafitties, figured satins, wrought go. Oh, I don't know this one. Grosgrains? Grosgrainus? Hmm. Mm. It may or may not be a real word. Grain. But we have a different spelling of it now, so that's fun. Wrought grosgrains, silk mohair, and ferret ribbons. Urged partly by curiosity and perhaps also by a subconscious hope that in the comic light of Miss Primrose's personality, recent events might lose something of their sinister horror, one morning, Dame Marigold set out to visit her old schoolmistress in her captivity. It was the first time she had left the house since the tragedy, and as she walked down the high street, she held her head high and smiled a little scornful smile, just to show the vulgar herd that even the worst disgrace could not break the spirit of a vigil. Now, Dame Marigold had very acute senses. Many a time she had astonished Master Nathaniel by her quickness in detecting the faintest whiff of any of the odours she disliked, shag, for instance, or onions. She was equally quick in psychological matters, and would detect the existence of a quarrel or love affair long before they were known to anyone except the parties concerned. And as she made her way that morning to the guild hall, she became conscious in everything that was going on round her of what one can only call a change of key. She could have sworn that the baker's boy with the tray of loaves on his head was not whistling, that the maidservant, leaning out of a window to tend her mistress's pot flowers, was not humming the same tune that they would have been some months ago. This perhaps was natural enough. Tunes, like fruit, have their seasons and are, besides, ever forming new species. But even the But even the voices of the hawkers chanting, "Yellow sand!" or "Knives and scissors!" sounded disconcertingly different. Instinctively, Dame Marigold's delicate nostrils expanded, and the corners of her mouth turned down in an expression of disgust, as if she had caught a whiff of a disagreeable smell. On reaching the guild hall, she carried matters with a high hand. No, there was no need whatever to disturb her worship. His worship? Since I've stopped for a second, I just want to listen to one of the characters. Okay. There was no need whatever to disturb his worship. He had given her permission to visit the prisoner, so would the guardian take her up immediately to her room. Dame Marigold was one of those women who, though they walk blindfold through the fields and woods, if you place them between four walls, have eyes as sharp as a naturalist's for the objects that surround them. So, in spite of her depression, her eyes were very busy as she followed the guardian up the splendid spiral staircase and along the panelled corridors hung here and there with beautiful bits of tapestry. She made a mental note to tell Master Nathaniel that the caretaker had not swept the staircase, and that some of the panelling was worm-eaten and should be attended to. And she would pause to finger a corner of the tapestry and wonder if she could find some silk, just that powder blue, or just that old rose for her own embroidery. "Why, I do declare this panel is beginning to go too," she murmured, pausing to tap on the wall. Then she cried in a voice of surprise, "I do believe it's hollow here." The guardian smiled indulgently. "You were just like the doctor, ma'am. Dr. Lear. We used to call him the woodpecker when he was studying the guild hall for his book, for he was forever hopping about and tapping on the walls. It was almost as if he were looking for something. It was almost as if he were looking for something, we used to say, and I'd never be surprised myself to come on a sliding panel. They do say as what those old dukes were a wild crew, and it might have suited their book very well to have a secret way out of their place." And he gave a knowing wink. "Yes, yes, it certainly might," said Dame Marigold thoughtfully. They had now come to a door, padlocked and bolted. "This is where we have put the prisoner, ma'am," said the guardian, unlocking it. And then he ushered her into the presence of her old schoolmistress. Miss Primrose was sitting bolt upright in a straight-backed, old-fashioned chair against a background of fine old tapestries, faded to the softest, loveliest pastel tints, as incongruous with her grotesque ugliness as had been the fresh prettiness of the crabapple blossoms. Dame Marigold stood staring at her for a few seconds in silent indignation. Then she sank slowly onto a chair and said sternly, "Well, Miss Primrose?" It's skipping ahead again. I wonder how you dare sit there so calmly after the appalling thing you have brought about. But Miss Primrose was in one of her most exalted moods, on her high hobby horse. On her high hobby horse, as the crabapple blossoms used to call it, so she merely glittered at Dame Marigold contemptuously out of her little eyes, and with a lordly wave of her hand, as if to sweep away from her all mundane trivialities, she exclaimed pityingly, "My poor blind Marigold! Perhaps of all the pupils who have passed through my hands, you are the one who are the least worthy of your noble birthright." Dame Marigold bit her lip, raised her eyebrows, and said in a low voice of intense blah, blah, blah. Okay, that time it was me. Raised her eyebrows, and said in a low voice of intense irritation, "What do you mean, Miss Primrose?" Miss Primrose cast her eyes up to the ceiling, and in her most treacly voice she answered, "The great privilege of having been born a woo-man." Her pupils always maintained that woman, as pronounced by Miss Primrose, was the most indecent word in the language. Dame Marigold's eyes flashed. I may not be a woman, but at any rate, I am a mother, which is more than you are," she retorted. Then, in a voice that at each word grew more indignant, she said, "And, Miss Primrose, do you consider that you yourself have been worthy of your noble birthright in betraying the trust that has been placed in you? Are vice and horror and disgrace and breaking the hearts of parents true womanliness? I should like to know. You are worse than a murderer, 10 times worse. And there you sit gloating over what you have done, as if you were a martyr or a public benefactor, as complacent and smug and misunderstood as a princess from the moon forced to herd goats. I do really believe." But Miss Primrose's shrillness screamed down her low-intoned indignation. "Shake me! Stick pins in me! Fling me into the dapple!" she shrieked. "I will bear it all with a smile, and wear my shame like a flower given by him." Dame Marigold groaned in exasperation. "Who on earth do you mean by him, Miss Primrose?" Then her irrepressible sense of humour broke out in a dimple, and she added, "Duke Aubrey or Endymion Lear?" For, of course, Prunella had told her all the jokes about the goose and the sage. At this question, Miss Primrose gave an unmistakable start. "Duke Aubrey, of course," she answered, but the look in her eyes was sly, suspicious, and distinctly scared. None of this was lost upon Dame Marigold. She looked her slowly up and down with a little mocking smile, and Miss Primrose began to writhe and to gibber. Said Dame Marigold meditatively. She had never liked the smell of Endymion Lear's personality. The recent crisis had certainly done him no harm. It had doubled his practice and trebled his influence. Besides, it cannot have been Miss Primrose's beauty and charms that had caused him to pay her recently such marked attentions. At any rate, it could do no harm to draw a bow at a venture. "I am beginning to understand, Miss Primrose," she said slowly. "Two outsiders have put their heads together to see if they could find a plan for humiliating the stupid, stuck-up, so-called old families of Lud. Oh, don't protest, Miss Primrose. You have never taken any pains to hide your contempt for us, and I have always realized that yours was not a forgiving nature. Nor do I blame you. We have laughed at you unmercifully for years, and you have resented it. All the same, I think your revenge has been an unnecessarily violent one, though I suppose, to a true woo-man, nothing is too mean, too spiteful, too base if it serves the interests of him. But Miss Primrose had gone as green as grass and was gibbering with terror. "Marigold! Marigold!" she cried, wringing her hands. "How can you think such things? The dear, devoted doctor, the best and kindest man in Lud-in-the-Mist. Nobody was angrier with me over what he called my criminal carelessness in allowing that horrible stuff to be smuggled into my loft. I assure you he is quite rabid on the subject of, er, fruit. Why, when he was a young man at the time of the great drought, he was working day and night trying to stop it. But not for nothing was Dame Marigold descended from generations of judges. Quick as lightning, she turned on her. The great drought? But that must be 40 years ago. Long before Endymion Mere came to Dorimare. Yes, yes, dear. Of course, quite so. I was thinking of what another doctor had told me. Since all this troubled my... Okay. Got myself tongue-tied while gibbering. And there it goes, skipping ahead again. Since all this trouble, my poor head gets quite muddled, gibbered Miss Primrose, and she was shaking from head to foot. Dame Marigold rose from her chair and stood looking down on her in silence for a few seconds, under half-closed lids, with a rather cruel little smile. Then she said, "Goodbye, Miss Primrose. You have provided me with most interesting food for thought." And then she left her, sitting there with frightened face against the faded tapestry. That same day, Master Nathaniel received a letter from Luke Hempen that both perplexed and alarmed him. It was as follows. "Your worship, I'd be glad if you'd take Master Ranulph away from this farm, because the widow is up to mischief. I'm sure of that. And some of the folks about here say as what in years gone by she murdered her husband, and she and somebody else, though I don't know who, seem to have a grudge against Master Ranulph. And if I might take the liberty, I'll just tell your worship what I heard. It was this way. One night, I don't know how it was, but I couldn't get to sleep, and thinking that a bite, maybe, of something would send me off, towards midnight I got up from my bed to go and look in the kitchen for a bit of bread. And halfway down the stairs I heard the sound of low voices, and someone said, 'I fear the Chanticleers.' So I stood still where I was and listened. And I peeped down, and the kitchen fire was nearly out, but there was enough left for me to see the widow and a man wrapped up in a cloak, sitting opposite to her with his back to the stairs, so I couldn't see his face. Their talk was low, and at first I could only hear words here and there, but they kept making mention of the Chanticleers." And then it jumped ahead again. Okay, 1 second here. And the man said something like keeping the Chanticleers and Master Ambrose Honeysuckle apart, because Master Ambrose had had a vision of Duke Aubrey, and if I hadn't known the widow and how she was a deep one, and as fly as you make them, I'd have thought they were two poor daft old gossips. Hang on, it's moving again. Whose talk had turned wild and nasty with old age. And then the man laid his hand on her knee, and his voice was low, but this time it was so clear that I could hear it all, and I think I can remember every word of it. So I'll write it down for your worship. I fear counter orders. You know the chief and his ways. At any moment he might betray his agents. Willie Wisp gave young Chanticleer fruit without my knowledge, and I told you how he and that doited old weaver of yours have been putting their heads together, and that's what has frightened me. And that's what has frightened me most. And then his voice became too low for me to hear, till he said, "Those who go by the Milky Way often leave footprints, so let him go by the other." And then he got up to go, and I crept back to my room. But not a wink of sleep did I get that night for thinking over what I had heard. For though it seemed gibberish, it gave me the shivers, and that's a fact. And mad folks are often as dangerous as bad ones. So I hope your worship will excuse me writing like this, and that you'll favour me. And that you'll favour me with an answer by return, and take Master Ranulph away, for I don't like the look in the widow's eye when she looks at him. And take Master Ranulph away, for I don't like the look in the widow's eye when she looks at him. That I don't. And hoping this finds your worship well as it leaves me, I am your worship's humble, obedient servant, Luke Hempen. How Master Nathaniel longed to jump onto his horse and ride post-haste to the farm, but that was impossible. Instead, he immediately dispatched a groom with orders to ride day and night and deliver a letter to Luke Hempen, which bade him instantly take Ranulph to the farm near Moongrass, a village that lay some 15 miles north of Swan-on-the-Dapple, from which for years he had got his cheeses. Then he sat down and tried to find some meaning in the I feel like I'm just losing it now. I can just sense, like, I'd probably take a break here right now if I wasn't recording this live, because I can feel myself just making more mistakes. Then he sat down and tried to find some meaning in the Then he sat down and tried to find some meaning in the mysterious Then he sat down and tried to find some meaning in the mysterious conversation Luke had overheard. Ambrose seeing a vision? An unknown chief? Footprints on the Milky Way? Reality was beginning to become very shadowy and menacing. He must find out something about this widow. Had she not once appeared in the law courts? He decided. Excuse me. I'm just losing it right now. Okay. He decided he must look her up without a moment's delay. He had inherited from his father a fine legal library, and the bookshelves in his pipe room were packed with volumes bound in vellum and old calf of edicts, codes, and trials. Some of them belonged to the days before printing had been introduced into Dorimare, and were written in the crabbed hand of old town clerks. It made the past very real, and threw a friendly, humorous light upon the dead to come upon, when turning those yellow parchment pages, some personal touch of the old scribes, such as a sententious or facetious insertion for his such as a sententious or facetious insertion of his own. For instance, "The law bides her time, but my dinner doesn't," or the caricature in the margin of some forgotten judge. It was just as if one of the grotesque plaster heads on the old houses were to give you, suddenly, a sly wink. But it was the criminal trials that, in the past, had given Master Nathaniel the keenest pleasure. The dry style of the law was such a magnificent medium for narrative, and the little details of everyday life, the humble objects of daily use, became so startlingly vivid when, like scarlet geraniums breaking through a thick autumn mist, they blazed out from that grey style, so vivid and often fraught with such tragic consequences. Great was his astonishment when he discovered from the index that it was among the criminal trials that he must look for the widow Gibbeties. What was more, it was a trial for murder. Surely Endymion Lear had told him, when he was urging him to send Ranulph to the farm, that it had been a quite trivial case concerning an aria? I don't know why I always. And I don't know if this is like a England American thing. Or never area. Oh dear. I told you I'm tired. And I know this too. That's what's sad. Concerning an arrear of wages, or something, due to a discharged servant? As a matter of fact, the plaintiff, a labourer of the name of Diggory Carp, had been discharged from the service of the late farmer Gibbety. But the accusation he brought against the widow was that she had poisoned her husband with the sap of osiers. I don't know what that is, and I don't know if that's, osiers? Hmm. Oh, that's dogwoods. Huh. I have one of those in my backyard. With the sap of osiers. I'm actually doing a quick edit here. I was lazy, I didn't wanna have to do the whole sentence again, so I really cut in with the sap of osiers, but it was a little bit kind of cut off, but I did some magic just then. Some audio magic. However, when he had finished the trial, Master Nathaniel found himself in complete sympathy with the judge's pronouncement that the widow was innocent, and with his severe reprimand to the plaintiff for having brought such a serious charge against a worthy woman on such slender grounds. But he could not get Luke's letter out of his head, and he felt that he would not have a moment's peace till the groom returned with news from the farm. As he sat that evening by the parlour fire, wondering for the 100th time who the mysterious cloaked stranger could have been whose back had been seen by Luke, Dame Marigold suddenly broke the silence by saying, "What do you know about Endymion Lear, Nat?" "What do I know of Endymion Lear?" he replied. He repeated absently, "Why, that he's a very good leech, with very poor taste in cravats, and, if possible, worse taste in jokes. And that, for some unknown reason, he has a spite against me." He broke off in the middle of his sentence and muttered beneath his breath, "By the sun, moon, and stars, supposing it should be." Luke's stranger had said he feared the Chanticleers. A strange fellow, Lear. The note had once sounded in his voice. The note had once sounded in his voice. Where did he come from? Who was he? Nobody knew in Lud-in-the-Mist. And then there were his antiquarian tastes. They were generally regarded as a harmless, unprofitable hobby, and yet the past was dim and evil, a heap of rotting leaves. The past was silent and belonged to the silent people. But Dame Marigold was asking another question, a question that had no apparent connection with the previous one. What was the year of the Great Drought? Master Nathaniel answered that it was exactly 40 years ago, and added quizzically, Why this sudden interest in history, Marigold? Again she answered by asking him a question. And when did Endymion Lear first arrive in Dorimare? Master Nathaniel began to be interested. Let me see, he said thoughtfully. It was certainly long before we married. Yes, I remember we called him in to Yes, I remember we called him in to a consultation with my mother. Okay, I'm just not going to get it. Also, is it pleurisy? Is that a thing? So, once more. Let me double check that one. No, not a pleurisy. Yeah, it is pleurisy. That was just one I wasn't sure on. Yes, I remember we called him in to a consultation when my mother had pleurisy, and that was shortly after his arrival. For he could still only speak broken Dorimarite. It must be 30 years ago. I see, said Dame Marigold dryly. But I happen to know that he was already in Dorimare at the time of the drought. And she proceeded to repeat to him her conversation that morning with Miss Primrose. And, she added, I've got another idea. And she told him about the panel in the guild hall that sounded hollow, and what the guardian had said about the woodpecker ways of Endymion Lear. And if partly for revenge for our coldness to him, and partly from a love of power, she went on, it is he who has been behind this terrible affair. A secret passage would be very useful in smuggling, and would explain how all your precautions have been useless. And who would be more likely to know about a secret passage in the guild hall than Endymion Lear? By the sun, moon, and stars! Exclaimed Master Nathaniel excitedly. I shouldn't be surprised if you were right, Marigold. You've got a head on your shoulders with something in it more useful than porridge. And Dame Marigold gave a little complacent smile. Then he sprang from his chair. I'm off to tell Ambrose, he cried eagerly. But would he be able to convince the slow and obstinate mind of Master Ambrose? Mere suspicions are hard to communicate. They are rather like the wines that will not travel, and have to be drunk on the spot. At any rate, he could but try. Have you ever had a vision of Duke Aubrey, Ambrose? He cried, bursting into his friend's pipe room. Master Ambrose frowned with annoyance. What are you driving at, Nat? He said huffily. Answer my question. I'm not chaffing you. I'm in deadly earnest. Have you ever had a vision of Duke Aubrey? Master Ambrose moved uneasily in his chair. He was far from proud of that vision of his. Well, he said gruffly, I suppose one might call it that. It was at the academy, the day that wretched girl of mine ran away, and I was so upset that there was some excuse for what you call visions. And did you tell anyone about it? Not I, said Master Ambrose emphatically. Then he caught himself up and added, Oh yes, I believe I did, though. I mentioned it to that spiteful little quack, Endymion Lear. I'm sure I wished I hadn't. Toasted cheese, what's the matter now, Nat? for Master Nathaniel was actually cutting a caper of triumph and glee. "I was right! I was right!" he cried joyfully, so elated by his own acumen that for the moment his anxiety was forgotten. "Read that, Ambrose," and he eagerly thrust into his hands Luke Hempen's letter. Sorry. I went without a water break there. Said Master Ambrose when he had finished it. "Well, what are you so pleased about?" "Don't you see, Ambrose?" cried Master Nathaniel impatiently. "That mysterious fellow in the cloak must be Endymion there. Nobody else knows about your vision." "Oh, yes, Nat. Blunt though my wits may be, I see that. But I fail to see how the knowledge helps us in any way." Then Master Nathaniel told him about Dame Marigold's theories and discoveries. Master Ambrose hummed and hawed and talked about women's reasoning and rash conclusions. But perhaps he was more impressed, really, than he chose to let Master Nathaniel see. At any rate, he grudgingly agreed to go with him by night to the guild hall and investigate the hollow panel. And, from Master Ambrose, this was a great concession, for it was not the sort of escapade that suited his dignity. "Hurrah, Ambrose!" shouted Master Nathaniel, "and I'm ready to bet a moongrass cheese. Against a flask of your best flour and amber that we'll find that rascally quack at the bottom of it all." "You'd always a wonderful eye for a bargain, Nat," said Master Ambrose with a grim chuckle. "Do you remember when we were youngsters, how you got my pedigree pup out of me for a stuffed pheasant? So moth-eaten that it had scarcely a feather to its name. And, let me see, what else? I think there was a half a packet of mouldy sugar candy. And I threw in a broken musical box, whose works used to go queer in the middle of To War, Bold Sons of Dorimare, and burr and buzz like a drunk cockchafer," put in Master Nathaniel proudly. "It was quite fair. Quantity for quality." "It was quite fair. Quantity for quality." Okay, that is the end of chapter 12 of Lud-in-the-Mist. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm going to be doing this some more. I still have 5 more hours of recording. Well, not 5 more finished hours of recording, so 10 more hours, 10 more sessions to do. I will be back on Sunday, which is what is Sunday? Sunday is the 30th of November. I will be back here at 2:30 PM Eastern Time. No, I don't know why I even said that. That's so ridiculous. 2:30 PM Pacific Time, since I am on the West Coast. I told you it's getting late. Um, but thanks so much for joining me. And yeah, if you wanna find out what happens next in the book, come join me for the live session or wait for the audiobook, which will come out in sometime like February. Bye for now.